Hi guys. Okay, so this is the class for week 10 on When Harry Met Sally. So, When Harry Met Sally, directed by Rob Reiner, is released in 1989. It's written by a screenwriter called Nora Ephron, and if you read the article that I've uploaded to eCampus, you'll kind of um, read a bit of a conversation about it. It was Nora Ephron's script, but it was also quite a collaborative process. The Billy Crystal and Meg Ryan both contributed quite a lot to the dialogue in the film, and Reiner and Ephron kind of worked on the script and the project together prior to shooting. So the film stars Meg Ryan and Billy Crystal. It's a romantic comedy, and it traces the friendship and eventual romance between the titular characters after they meet on a road trip between Chicago and New York. We're going to come back to this idea of character development quite a lot throughout this kind of throughout the PowerPoint, because it is a really key thing about what When Harry Met Sally does as a comedy, and also about what I want to say about the role that the city in general plays kind of within the film. Um, so yeah, after they meet, which we'll know if they've seen it, they don't see each other for years, and then they bump into each other a couple of times. They strike up a friendship, even though they didn't like each other initially. They spend a night together that causes a crisis in the friendship because Harry can't confront his actual feelings. He tries to pretend that nothing's happened, and then finally, Harry realizes his feelings. Sally forgives him for, kind of being an asshole, and um, they get together, and we get the impression that it kind of ends happily ever after. Which means that the film follows the kind of conventions of a comedy and of a romantic comedy. Has a happy ending in which a couple comes together for life, and we see that prior to that, the couple face a number of challenges on the way to realizing their happiness. It isn't just intended to be a kind of sugary, soft story. However, it's also intended to be something more like a kind of witty observation. It's intended to contain a series of witty observations about kind of contemporary life, and also about contemporary dating and contemporary romance, at least in the time the film was made, late 80s, early 90s. And again, as we go on, we'll see the way in which the entire worldview that the film kind of presents is dictated by the kind of class position and by the sexuality of the two characters. And it's this class position, even though it's not mentioned directly in the film, which kind of gives it its optimistic quality. It's known, even though Harry throughout the film is a kind of typically cynical character. He claims that he's not interested in love. Really, he doesn't see much of a future for himself after he divorces from his wife. He kind of is a bit of a womanizer. Nonetheless, he kind of comes round to how much he loves Sally. Sally stays kind of eternally optimistic, even though she's disappointed by Harry at one point in the film. So yeah, it gives this kind of optimistic view of romance that ultimately things will work out between couples, between heterosexual couples at least, which are the only couples that we see in the movie. And again, we're going to see how this sense of kind of optimism is tied quite deeply to the way in which the film represents the city, and the city of New York in particular. So, the first thing that I want to draw attention to, and that I kind of mentioned before, is an idea of linear lives. So, an idea of character development, which takes place whereby characters start off in one position, they experience things, they grow and change, and they wind up in another position. They wind up as being different people from who they were at the start of the film. The way that When Harry Met Sally is plotted, the kind of time jumps that you get in the movie, the evolving relationship between the two characters, each of these are intended to create this sense of development. And in some ways, it makes the film kind of realistic, gives it a weight and a realism. In other ways, which we'll talk about, there's also a kind of sense in which this development, this kind of linear quality to a life, is actually not something which is to be taken for granted. However, we'll start by saying, just to give a kind of literary term, the German term Bildung, which means development or culture or even education, is often used to refer to literature. You can use it to refer to film as well, which is concerned with the development of character, which is concerned with a kind of life as it evolves over time. Bildungsroman is a novel which follows a protagonist throughout the course of their life and shows how they go from a state of immaturity to a state of maturity in which they've reached knowledge of themselves and in which they can be who they were meant to be. In some ways, When Harry Met Sally is a kind of Bildungsroman, which means that we start at the beginning, or what is the beginning for their characters. Sorry guys, ignore that. I'm going to disconnect myself from the internet because I can't be bothered with this happening this time. Okay, we'll start again. So it's a Bildungsroman. It's a film which follows character development and which relies on a specific kind of world in which characters can develop in this way. And we see that the way in which the development continues throughout the film begins with Harry and Sally driving from Chicago to New York. So they take a long road trip. Harry is going out with Sally's best friend. They've both graduated college and they kind of talk along the way. Sally says she's going to New York because she wants things to happen. So she's very firmly focused on the future. Harry's cynical. He says it's not necessarily the case that anything will happen, but he's also kind of going to New York in order to get on with a new stage in his life. And we see this in the scene, and we see it in the sequence in the movie in which we first see New York. We see them kind of driving into New York after we've had the opening sequence in which they are talking to each other in the car, and in which they go to the motel, go to the diner, and Harry kind of propositions Sally and she turns him down. So if we look at the scene in which they enter New York, just think about the way in which Reiner shoots New York in this scene. It's the morning. It looks like the morning. That's the Chrysler building. Maybe you guys can name some of the other buildings. I can't, but it's the Manhattan skyline. Instantly recognizable. It's the fall, so you have this kind of beautiful golden light. Entering into New York. We see the Twin Towers here. This is a very famous archway in Manhattan as well. Then they enter in, and we see they have this kind of conversation, and then we see Harry and Sally walking off, and we see Harry walking off. And look at the way that the camera kind of tracks back. Harry gets smaller. And they kind of disappear into the city, and we assume that they're going to get on with their lives in some degree or another. And what I say here, and again, what I kind of want you guys to think about more or less throughout the whole film, is the way in which the city functions as this kind of as this scene or as this context in which these kind of linear lives, these lives that will involve development and change, but will ultimately take place kind of on a straight line, um, are going to take place. Now, New York is the scene in which this will happen. It is the stage on which Harry and Sally will conduct their lives, play out their lives. And again, we have a time jump in the movie. So the next time that we see them, it's 5 years after the sequence that's just happened. We see them in an airport. Harry immediately identifies himself according to his job. He says he's kind of a political consultant. He's not even really talking to Sally at this point, but he talks to an old friend who is now dating Sally. And they just kind of have this sense of having moved forward in their lives. They've become more professional. And when they meet again on the plane, first of all, they're on a plane, so they now don't have to drive places. They have a kind of enough of an income to be able to afford air travel. And they're dressed kind of like professionals. So we assume that in some way or another they've kind of moved forward with their lives. We learn that Sally is working as a journalist, maybe not a great journalist, but a journalist nonetheless, and that Harry's kind of satisfied with his job. And we can see, I think, here immediately and throughout the film, there's a kind of contrast here between the kinds of people that we see in Blade Runner, the kind of despair that we see in Blade Runner. Think of a character like J.F. Sebastian, who, while he's probably the most sympathetic character in the whole film, is also completely trapped. He's got no future, and really none of the people on Earth have a future in Blade Runner. They're the kind of, they're the discarded, the surplus population who don't participate in this kind of narrative of fulfillment, the kind of, the character growth which Harry and Sally undergo, which middle class individuals are able to undergo with this kind of economic security that they possess as the foundation for it, is not for them. It's also, the people in welfare that we see also are kind of living these lives which are much more circular, which are much more caught up in kind of repeating patterns, then we see Harry and Sally being caught up, and we get much more of a sense of this kind of, as I say, progression. Yeah, they're middle class college graduates. They're living at a point in history in which they can expect to have a kind of future oriented career, and they make advancements in their lives which are marked by their job and by their romantic life as well. And Sally's boyfriend is equally professional, and on the plane, Harry reveals that he's kind of getting married. And all of this sense of linearity then provides this kind of ground for what I would call kind of a comedy of manners, which is a comedy which consists not entirely but largely of kind of witty observations about the way that, quote unquote, people behave. So Harry is this kind of cynical character. He's full of a dry wit. He's not always especially likable. In fact, a lot of the time he isn't very likable, but both Sally and the film kind of want us to reluctantly agree that some of the things that he says are right, even though he's kind of cynical and sarcastic. And again, despite this, we kind of know that the film is heading towards a kind of romantic resolution. So we have this kind of combination of this dry wit and this kind of drive towards a kind of happy ending, which kind of is part of the film's convention as a comedy, and it's also kind of backed up by the kind of couples that we see throughout the movie, the kind of talking headshots, which again is suggesting that Harry and Sally are going to enter into some kind of happily ever after situation. However, because it's also a comedy, it has to involve a kind of at least one moment, several moments of crisis in which the plan that the characters has for themselves will in some way kind of be called into doubt or be called into question. And we see this in Harry and Sally when they meet for the third time and their romantic relationships are kind of falling apart. This, in some ways, kind of disrupts the expected path that their lives are going to take. This kind of sense of linear progression, but at the same time, it also opens up a new avenue of experience, especially for Harry, who begins to realize that he is capable of being friends with Sally and that he's not just interested in a kind of sexual relationship with her. And while that might seem like quite a basic thing for a 30 whatever year old man to realize, it is still a moment of, again, it's a moment of character growth for Harry. And from this point on, his character kind of changes slightly. And again, we can see the way in which Rayner shoots New York as a kind of stage and as a backdrop for these kind of realizations. The city is a very safe space in which Harry and Sally grow together, in which they begin to develop their friendship. And we can see this in the sequence where they're becoming friends, which is this sequence here. It's a very short one. But they have dinner, then they walk out afterwards.
Really, what's so hard about finding an apartment?
Again, look at the light. It's like it's kind of perennially autumn in When Harry Met Sally, which is the most beautiful, famously the most beautiful time of year in New York.
You read the obituary column. You find out who died, go to the building, and then you tip the dome.
And Sally's kind of Harry's story is kind of full of this dry wisdom about how to get an apartment by looking up the obituaries, so finding out when someone's died and then using that information to get the apartment that they've left behind. We might have a little echo here of Rosemary's Baby too, but obviously this is a very different kind of film. But look at the light. You know, look at the way that he's shooting the street, which is almost empty.
Leaving a wife, 2 children, and a spacious 3-bedroom apartment with a wood-burning fireplace. You know, the first time we met, I really didn't like it that much.
I didn't like you.
Yeah, you did. You were just so uptight.
And again, Harry's being very obnoxious. Sally is kind of learning to begrudgingly like him. He's opening up a little bit. They're developing as characters in this scene, and they're becoming slightly more vulnerable in each other's company. You know, this is kind of classic romantic comedy behavior, and the city is functioning as this kind of deeply safe, beautiful space for them to do this. Notice also Reiner has kind of brought in soft focus at this point too. It's even kind of blurry, it's borderline impressionist.
Take that kind of remark. It sounds like a compliment, but really it's an insult.
Okay, you're still as hard as nuts.
I just didn't want to sleep with you, and you had to write it off as a character flaw instead of dealing with the possibility that it might have something to do with you.
What's the statute of limitations on apologies?
10 years.
Ooh, I can just get it in under the wire.
Would you like to have dinner with me sometime?
Are we becoming friends now?
Well, yeah.
Great. A woman friend. You know, you may be the first attractive woman.
Then just look at this shot again. Look at the shadows on the trees. The light is at exactly the right place. It's just, you get a kind of sense of urban life, but you get a kind of sense of urban life which is entirely secure. There's no one else on the street. There's none of this sense of a kind of overwhelming, teeming crowd. There are crowds in When Harry Met Sally. There's crowds when they eat in the restaurant and the cafe. There's crowds in the airport scene, but they never possess this kind of quality of menace or of threat, or even just of excess, like the quality that they possess in Taxi Driver. The city is just kind of functioning as this textured environment through which Harry and Sally move, and through which they can realize their their development. So yeah, their own, as I say here, the representations of urban life show the kind of developing relationship between the two characters, and their own personal narratives and what I call their Bildung is the most important thing in these kind of scenes. It's what we're supposed to be paying attention to. But at the same way, Rainer uses the kind of tapestries of the city and uses recognizable aspects of urban life to create the backdrop for this kind of development to take place. And we see this almost to a ludicrous degree, I think. This is a beautiful picture already. This is what Central Park looks like in the fall, and it's the most notoriously gorgeous time to be in New York. And in the scene about halfway through the film, which is set in the Metropolitan Museum, we really see this kind of fantastical element of the way the city is presented coming out. This is the Met. So this is in the Met. I don't know. Maybe some of you guys have been. If you haven't and you're ever in New York, go, because it's a really great museum. Overlooks the park, or part of the park. Central Park is huge. And this is an Egyptian temple, which is actually in the Metropolitan Museum. It's an old Egyptian, or part of an old Egyptian temple. And it's always really, really busy. It's the busiest part of one of the busiest museums in New York, if not one of the busiest museums in the world.
Not for the rest of them.
And when Harry Met Sally, it's almost entirely empty.
Hey, we are going to talk like this.
Like this?
No, please, to repeat after me. Pepper, 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 pepper.
And it kind of forms the scene. Again, look at the way that Rainer frames them against the kind of autumn colors. He's using soft focus again to accentuate the beauty of the background. And at the same time, they engage in what is intended to be quite a kind of, maybe not realistic, but almost like an everyday conversation. And it's an important moment in their development of characters, in the development of their characters, because it's the moment in which Sally says for the first time that she's going on a date. So they're not going to hang out in the evening.
Oh, I think it's great that you have a date.
You do?
Yeah.
Wide shot again, we see the trees again, we see the beautiful autumn light coming through. But again, the scene itself, the dialogue is supposed to speak quite personally and quite closely to who these people are supposed to be as characters.
Is that what you're going to wear?
Yeah. Well,
There are two other people and one guy, one museum attendant in the busiest museum in the world. This is not what the Met is like.
no. Why?
I think you should wear skirts more. You look really good in skirts.
I do?
Yeah. You know, I have a theory that hieroglyphics are really an ancient comic strip about a character named Sphinxy.
You know, Harry, I think you should get out there too.
Oh, I'm not ready.
You should.
I would not be good for anybody right now.
It's time.
And again, this is a scene in which Harry gets to show, or in which the audience sees that Harry's kind of being defensive. He needs to grow. He needs to make himself vulnerable again. And Sally shows him that he should, kind of insist that he should go out and date. And these are supposed to be scenes of character growth, scenes of character development, and kind of realistic scenes. Are supposed to be scenes that a certain audience would relate to as being a part of their lives. However, they're taking place in this absurd fantasy situation. And then look at that apartment. It's huge. It's the biggest. I don't know anyone who could afford an apartment like this, let alone in Manhattan. But at the same time, we're supposed to kind of accept it as in some ways, a kind of normal feature of city life. But the point that I'm laboring a little bit here is that it's kind of a fantastical vision of this. It's almost a perfect vision. And it should cause us to reflect a little bit on what we might think of as kind of the realism of When Harry Met Sally and of romantic comedy in general, of which this is a paradigmatic example. You see this kind of combination, is what I'm trying to say, of what's intended to be a kind of realism with a completely fantastical, exaggerated, idealized version of what the city is like. And this even happens in situations in which the characters appear to be unhappy. At the same time that they're unhappy, we also see them inhabiting enormous apartments. We see this in the montage sequence when Harry is kind of throwing cards into a bowl. He starts off sad. This is the closest we get to seeing him at work. He's not doing anything.
You sleeping?
No, I was watching Casablanca.
Channel, please.
11.
Thank you. Got it. Now you're telling me you would be happy with Victor Laszlo than with Humphrey Bogart?
This is the only time we see Sally at
Why
work.
drove to New York?
I never said that. I would never have said that.
All right, fine. Have it your way.
These are little, and again we
You been
see
sleeping?
Why?
Because I haven't been sleeping. I really
the
miss
size of Harry's apartment. Sorry, it's just amazing. Like, look at it. But at the same time, what's being described in the monologue is this kind of experience of urban alienation. They're unhappy and they're growing together as friends as a result of their experience of this kind of alienation. And they're getting over their kind of crisis that they've experienced in their emotional lives through coming together as friends. And it's this, as we know, that will later mean that they become romantically involved finally at the end of the film. But this kind of quote unquote realism is taking place against the backdrop of this completely unrealistic, well, in this example, living situation. Look at how beautifully the windows are framed as well. Again, the light is perfect. It's an extremely aestheticized, we can say, representation of the city, while at the same time kind of drawing on a similar kind of urban alienation that we've seen in other movies, that we've seen in Taxi Driver, for example, but it's doing it and it's showing this in a kind of completely different register to the register that we've experienced in the other films. And this is really what the kind of genre, this is how we can view the way that genre affects visuals, I think, as well. And again, Rosemary's Baby is a film about domestic spaces, and here we see a domestic space which is almost the polar opposite of the kind of claustrophobia that we see Mia Farrow's character inhabiting by the end of the film. Huge spaces, huge amount of light, almost nothing in the apartment. It almost just wants to emphasize how much room there is, which again creates this beautiful urban backdrop, but is just completely fantastical. So yeah, we can say again that the film attempts to reflect the lives of the audience, or of a certain kind of middle class audience who would go and see the movie, but at the same time it presents them with a kind of idealized version of these lives. So one in which the real difficulties of renting, employment, and insecurity have been removed, in which all the parks are beautiful, and in which all the apartments are enormous. And we kind of have to juggle this contradiction between what is posited for us as a kind of realistic psychological study of a funny psychological study, but psychological nonetheless, of the way that contemporary relationships are supposed to function, with the kind of generic conventions, or the genre conventions of the comedy, which enable us to see this kind of really idealized version of urban life. And we see this again a little bit, I want to argue, in the way that Chance Encounters work in When Harry Met Sally. So basically, the whole plot revolves around kind of repeating random encounters. So Harry and Sally meet 3 times before they actually become friends, and the first time they meet because Sally's friend is dating Harry. Second and third time they meet, it's purely by chance. And again, we've seen in other films how the kind of arbitrary and the contingent within the city and within urban life sit alongside the very carefully planned out and the very rigid. Within When Harry Met Sally, you get this kind of sense of fate, a kind of romantic fate, as they keep meeting. And if you look back from the end of the film, it seems very clear that they were always kind of destined to be together, and that all that they needed to do was to realize this. But a condition of realizing this is the kind of is the chance encounter which they undergo. And we also see how this might how this kind of chance encounter might plunge someone into a crisis, as it does when Harry meets his ex-wife, bumps into his ex-wife, you could say, in the kind of department store that they're hanging out in. But again, because this is a comedy, these kind of accidents and these kinds of contingencies form part of the whole kind of narrative of the character's development, and they don't dominate that development. They don't threaten that development in any kind of meaningful way. And we can see how contingency is totally different in the scenes in Rosemary's Baby, the outside scenes in Rosemary's Baby, and also in Welfare. We talked last week about how in Welfare you get these kind of accidents which produce potentially devastating effects on people's lives if they lose a folder or if they tick the wrong box or something like this. You see that in that woman when her friend says that she may as well be Jane Doe. Reiner, When Harry Met Sally, doesn't present contingency as anything really threatening. And what I want to say is that there's this sense that because the lives remain kind of basically linear, and because we're talking about a kind of story of two middle-class characters engaging in this kind of emotional development, then contingency just gets kind of subsumed within their development. It's never threatening, really. So yeah, just to wrap up, we see that Reiner's representation of the city shares things in common with other films. However, the class position of the characters and the film's genre as a romantic comedy means that rather than overwhelming the lives of the characters or threatening them or defining them completely, the unique features of urban life become a part of their own personal narrative. So I think When Harry Met Sally is probably the only film we've seen in which the city is really consistently just a backdrop, even though it's obviously determining the way in which the characters live. It really functions as a very ever-present kind of visual backdrop to what is essentially a story about the characters themselves, and in which the city itself doesn't need to play a huge role. And we can think about the ways in which even this kind of character growth itself is something that, on the one hand, we might think of as being a universal part of who we are. People grow over time, they learn from their experiences. But if we compare the kind of growth that Harry and Sally are able to experience, then if we compare that growth with other characters that we see in other films, we can see that this isn't actually universal. It's not open for everyone in the same way. For example, we'd say here the workers in Metropolis they do the same thing day in, day out. They have almost no free time. There's no way that you could have this kind of romantic emotional story, this story of emotional maturity and development with workers who are working 18 hours a day in a factory. It just wouldn't make sense to claim that kind of Bildung would be possible. And again, the replicants in Blade Runner, they have to rebel in order to grow. Their personal growth, their development is almost entirely contingent on the fact that they challenge the kind of social structures. They want to tear down the city that they're in as much as they want to immerse themselves in it and have it as the backdrop for their life. So yeah, while When Harry Met Sally wants to be a kind of story about something that we might all recognize, and to an extent it is, I'm not denying that growth and development are a part of life. Obviously they are. But at the same time, they do require, at least in the way it's presented in Harry Met Sally, they do require certain kinds of economic positions and certain kinds of historical periods. And we'll talk next week when we talk about The Purge that these periods might be coming to an end. They might have come to an end 10, 15 years or so after When Harry Met Sally was filmed. And this is going to raise new questions for how we think about urban populations. So yeah, these economic conditions are a kind of precondition for the kinds of crisis and existential problems and growth that Harry and Sally as characters undergo. And this kind of growth is what makes When Harry Met Sally this kind of classic example of the modern rom-com. That isn't a criticism of the film in any way, but it's something that when we compare the film to the other movies that we watch, we can have in our minds, and we can see the way, even in a film in which class doesn't appear to mean anything at all, because everyone's middle class in When Harry Met Sally, except for the waiters, and they don't really say anything. But we can see how this, it mediates life and it defines the kind of possibilities for a life, and because of this, it defines the way in which we, both visually and in terms of the narrative, experience and understand what the city is doing in the film. Okay, guys, so tasks for the week. As usual, pick one of the sequences and write an analysis of it. If you know that you want to work on When Harry Met Sally for either the oral or the written assessment, then I would recommend doing this exercise as a kind of preparation. Again, as always, if you send it to me, I will look at it for you and I'll try and give you some feedback. And yeah, the question for the catch-up session is just to do with how realistic you guys think the film is. So Rob Reiner and Nora Ephron said that they wanted the film to have a realism to it. Obviously, it's still a comedy. We still know that it's going to end happily. But at the same time, it's supposed to kind of give these psychological insights, whether we agree with them or not. And the characters are supposed to behave in kind of recognizable ways. So the question is, do you guys think the film is realistic? If so, in what ways is it realistic? And what parts of the film appear to be unrealistic? We can think about that in terms of narrative, in terms of dialogue, but also I think for When Harry Met Sally, especially visually, thinking about the different ways in which Reiner shoots the city and what he gets out of New York, in comparison to how Scorsese views New York, for example, or the New York of Frederick Wiseman, which is New York, which, with the exception of one shot, we never see the outside of. Okay, guys, so that's it. Next week we're going back to LA. Actually, we have 2 LA movies to end the course. We spent quite a lot of time in New York this semester. I hope that you're all doing well. As I say in the intro meeting, the orals are due a week on Friday. I'll remind you about this in the catch-up session. And yeah, take care, guys. I hope you like When Harry Met Sally. It's very much a movie of its time, but I also think that for what it is, it's really enjoyable too. And I hope that you like it. And yeah, take care. Bye.